The history of American corporate management is the history of mind-numbing incompetence, total ignorance, and complete failure. In 1960, the United States was the world's largest producer of consumer electronics, radios, televisions, other such devices. It got wiped out because they failed to adapt transistors and they failed to maintain quality. The U.S. company came up with the clever idea of having the works in a drawer. You could open and pull out a drawer to replace the failed packages. At this point, they had converted largely to transistors. It never occurred to them to just build a higher quality product in the first place, which is what the Japanese did, which is why the American consumer electronics industry got wiped out and is really no longer existent. Then we had, of course, the U.S. steel industry. Little detail, the entirety of the U.S. steel industry was obsolete in the 1960s. There wasn't one steel mill capable of producing good quality steel. Steelmaking is a two-part process. Part one, you have iron ore, which is iron oxide. You have to get the oxygen off of the iron. The way that is done is you take the iron ore, grind it up, and add it with finely ground coal. If you heat that in a low oxygen environment, what happens is the oxygen prefers the carbon to the iron, and it then produces carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, which are greenhouse gases. But you now have what is often called pig iron or various other products. It has a high carbon content. Carbon is good in the fact that carbon helps to prevent corrosion. It also makes the material hard, which means that it's scratch resistant. The problem is that it's brittle. It snaps. And one of the main reasons to use steel in construction, ships, buildings, bridges, is that it yields. It doesn't just snap, it stretches, which may deform it and may make it no longer usable, but it doesn't break. Before it fails, steel gives you a safety factor. Cast iron, high carbon iron products have no safety factor. They just snap. What is needed is a way of reducing the carbon. And there's various things that have been done. The method that was adopted in the 1890s was called open hearth. And open hearth sounds totally goofy, but apparently it worked. And that is you have a trough or a sluiceway or a gutter, if you want to call it, and you pour the liquid iron product, the high carbon product, into the sluiceway. It then, of course, runs down the sluiceway under gravity. At the same time, fans blow air across the liquid iron. And the fans, of course, have oxygen in the air, and the oxygen, the iron is extremely hot, over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the carbon reacts with the oxygen, a fair amount of the carbon anyway, and the carbon is then carried off, and you have reduced carbon in your metal. Beginning in 1948, two guys from Switzerland came up with an alternative method. The first of these plants was built in Austria in 1948, and the process is sometimes called the Steyr-Linz process. You take a big vat of liquid iron. You take a ceramic pipe, you stick the ceramic pipe into the liquid iron, and you blow pure oxygen into it, the same way you'd blow into a bubble tea. The oxygen bubbles through the iron and reduces the carbon. By the mid-1950s, there was a plant built in Austria, there was a plant built in Brazil, there was a plant built in Japan, and there was a plant built in Canada. There were no plants built in the United States. In the 1950s, the U.S. steel industry was selling all the steel they could make, pretty much. Highways were being built, buildings were being built. We still had a shipbuilding industry then. We lost the shipbuilding industry, but a lot of that was labor costs. They could sell all the steel. None of them bothered to build one of these mills, the Steyr-Linz mills. There's a version of it called basic oxygen. You have a basic line, meaning not acid, but basic lining to your vat, and you have the oxygen from the ceramic pipe. Brazil had one of these plants. Now, Brazil has a lot of iron ore. Brazil's products were sugarcane, coffee, and beef, and maybe some oranges. Brazil had a more modern steel mill than the United States because none of the U.S. steel mills would bother to build one, even as a test plant. They had the money. They were making all the money they could want. For the 1950s, they were getting big bonuses. Nothing compared to what executives are today, but they were still earning a lot of money. Everybody was happy. Nobody bothered trying to build a new process. The high point of this was the Bethlehem Steel Company decided to build a new steel mill at Sparrows Point, which is an area outside of Baltimore. Most of the iron ore used in the United States comes up from Brazil. By building it in Baltimore, you have easy access to the Atlantic Ocean, Chesapeake Bay, and direct deliveries of Brazilian iron ore. By the 1890s, at a place called Sparrows Point outside of Baltimore, a steel mill had been built. This steel mill was purchased somewhere around 1910 by the Bethlehem Steel Company, which continued to operate it. In the 1950s, they decided they were going to build the world's largest steel mill. They had a choice between open hearth, which is what all their steel mills used, and of course the Steyr-Linz process. They had technical reports about the Steyr-Linz process. The technical reports had three main conclusions, and these are reports written by people like metallurgists, academics. And what they said was, in the conclusions of the technical reports was number one, it produced better quality steel, and steel can have different properties. You have ultimate strength, you have hardness, you have ductility, you have toughness. Ultimate strength means the ultimate point at which it breaks. Ductility means the ability of the steel to stretch. Yield point means the point at which it begins to stretch. Hardness means the ability to resist scratching. Toughness means the ability to withstand repeated load. All of these properties, depending which property you want to maximize, you can do it better with the Starr-Lynch process. The second point was that it was more consistent batch from batch. This is incredibly important for manufacturing. If you're stamping a piece of metal, if you're drilling a piece of metal, if it doesn't perform the way you expect, you can wind up damaging the piece of steel, and it can also wind up damaging the equipment, whether it's a stamping press or a drill bit. So that's pretty good. Third point is the one you think might have gotten their attention. It costs less per ton of steel. It was less expensive to make the steel with the Starr-Lynch process, which would give them the option of either being more competitive and reducing prices or taking more profit. When they went to build the new expanded Sparrows Point mill, you may have guessed, they went with the open hearth, a process which at that point was over 50 years old and completely obsolete. Even though they had reports telling them that there was a better process, they still built the obsolete process. The only reason the U.S. steel industry survived was because the U.S. government protected them from foreign competition. So much for corporations being against government regulations. In the early 1980s, structural steel in the United States, this is the steel used for buildings, which is kind of the garbage end of steelmaking, had a yield point of 36 KSI, which is 36,000 pounds per square inch, and that is the point at which it starts to stretch. That was American-made steel. Canadian steel had 50 KSI. That's a significant improvement. And the Japanese were producing good quality steel, and the Europeans were producing good quality steel, and the Brazilians were producing high-quality steel. You could buy better steel from Brazil than you could from the United States. Sparrows Point Mill today is closed. I think the area where it is built is currently being used for an Amazon warehouse. We lost the steel industry because they were incompetent and failed to modernize. Then there was the U.S. auto industry. They failed to improve quality, just like the consumer electronics industry. They were producing garbage quality cars. Everybody knew they were garbage quality cars. Everybody knew they had a high defect rate. Anybody who was an idiot knew they had to improve the quality of their cars. Well, they apparently weren't even idiots. They didn't improve the quality of the cars. The Japanese began selling cars, and they almost got annihilated. In the 1980s, when the U.S. automobile industry was on the brink of maybe really going out of existence, Ronald Reagan, the great free trader, decided to talk the Japanese into voluntary import quotas, which of course were not voluntary at all. Then, of course, we have the banking industry. In the late 1980s, the banks kept on loaning money for people to buy houses and property. They were grossly overvalued. As will tend to happen, people start bidding up values, and they were bidding up the values beyond a sustainable limit. There wasn't enough revenue to cover the loans, both people's personal expenses, buying a house that they really couldn't afford, and also companies putting up buildings where they would not get enough rents to cover the loans, but they kept on loaning the money. And of course, what happened was, inevitably, the market collapsed, and the U.S. economy was severely damaged. Between 2000 and 2008, the banks kept on loaning money for people to buy houses and property. They were grossly overvalued. As will tend to happen, people start bidding up values, and they were bidding up the values beyond a sustainable limit. There wasn't enough revenue to cover the loans, both people's personal expenses, buying a house that they really couldn't afford, and also companies putting up buildings where they would not get enough rents to cover the loans, but they kept on loaning the money. And of course, what happened was, inevitably, the market collapsed, and the U.S. economy was severely damaged. Yes, I just replayed the same audio clip because they did the same thing. There is a quote attributed to Otto von Bismarck: "Fools say they learn from their own mistakes. I choose to learn from the mistakes of others." Actually, people who've looked into it said Bismarck wasn't the first person to say it. He might have said it, but he wasn't the first, so he doesn't get credit. They're not even fools. The people who screwed up in 2005 to 2008 when the U.S. economy was destroyed by banks giving loans that couldn't be repaid, that whole run-up was done by people who had been in the banking industry 20 years earlier. The senior executives of the banks took more than 20 years to get there. They had been part of the banking industry when all the damage had been done in 1989, and they repeated it 20 years later. They're not even stupid. In case you haven't been keeping score, the consumer electronics industry was lost because they failed to maintain quality and modernize. The steel industry was lost because they failed to modernize. The automobile industry was lost because they failed to maintain quality. And the banking industry threw itself off a cliff, not once, but twice, in 20 years. These people get brought in front of Congress and treated as though they're experts. These people have meetings with the president. Why would you meet with people who are demonstrably stupid? Every one of them has ruined their own industry. Why would you care what their opinion is? These people have no idea what they're doing. We are dealing not with talented and competent people, but abnormally stupid people. Why does anybody take these ignorant buffoons seriously? They're total useless, incompetent morons. There are a lot of people who say they want government run like a business. Isn't the government run badly enough already? But we have other industries, right? We have the commercial aircraft industry. Have you heard the stories about Boeing airliners falling out of the sky? And of course, we have all the digital industry. No major screw ups there. We also have a pipeline company that was too stupid to have adequate security against being hacked and apparently paid a ransom to blackmailers. The entirety of U.S. corporations are all run like country clubs. And the problem, of course, is that it's a closed group. The people who are on boards of directors, the people who get hired to run corporations are all of the same mentality. I think it's schizophrenia. I think it's paranoid schizophrenia. I think it's poorly socialized paranoid schizophrenia, which is why they can't make decisions, why they blame other people, and why they're terrified of anybody who's actually competent. But it's a blocked position. They control everything. People of the same mentality control everything. So you can't reform it. There's no starting point for the reform. All of the boards of directors have the same people. So when they bring in a new member of the board of directors, he thinks just like they do and is just as stupid. Under U.S. corporate culture, capitalism is a suicide pact. If you want to argue against capitalism, look at how the U.S. economy is